the worst situation is in Gaza. Israel started an open genocide and ethnic cleansing. Why are all the, let me say, Arab states so passive? Even Russia and China are on sidelines. Why all of us are allowing Israel to pursue with this genocide policy?
So I think countries like Egypt or Saudi Arabia or the Emirates, they don't want a war on their territory. They don't want to be bombed. They don't want to have disaster. And they're trying diplomatically to do something. I don't think it's just empty rhetoric. Every day, every week at the United Nations, there's another attempt at a ceasefire, another attempt at a Security Council resolution, another attempt at a General Assembly resolution. Now the United States is basically alone with Israel in saying no to the whole rest of the world. The most recent vote on Palestinian self-determination in the UN General Assembly had all countries in favor, 4 against: Israel, the United States, Micronesia, and Nauru. You don't get much more of a lopsided vote than that. There were a few abstentions as well. But Micronesia has 113,000 people. Nauru, with all respect, has 12,000 people. Basically, the United States and Israel are alone. And so also China and Russia are looking, and diplomatically, this is not bad for them. They're the country that claims to be the world leader can't get anyone to side with it other than Micronesia and Nauru and Israel. You have the South African government filing a case in the International Court of Justice, asking the court to stop Israel's genocide. The United States leaders must know that this is a case that makes the U.S. complicit, because the U.S. is directly arming everything that Israel's doing by the day, by the way, not just in past stockpiles or years and years of support, but daily. The U.S. is the enabler of what Israel is doing, because Israel could not do this for a few days without the United States shipments of missiles, munitions, arms equipment, and so on. So this is all extraordinary. But I think the basic answer to your question is no one wants to be bombed by Israel.
And why is Israel's Jewish lobby so powerful in the United States? We have impression that the Prime Minister Netanyahu is sitting in the White House instead of President Biden.
Well, I think there are several points to this. One is that war is the biggest business in the United States. This is $1 trillion a year operation. We have very powerful interests in the United States that are part of this establishment, by the way, including the university systems, because they get huge amounts of funding from donors that are completely part of the military-industrial complex, some of it quite direct, because companies like Raytheon or Northrop Grumman or Boeing or others give money to the universities to set up their international relations departments. The big companies, the big 5, Boeing and Northrop Grumman and General Dynamics, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, the big 5 have hundreds of billions of dollars of contracts from the Pentagon. And many, many other consultant companies have huge contracts. And big tech in Silicon Valley has huge contracts with the Pentagon. This is big business. So this is a big story. It also, and the Israeli military is basically a part of the US military industrial complex. So it's all part of the same story. And you have a lot of congressmen and senators, especially those on the Armed Services Committee, whose campaigns are paid for by this industry. It's pretty widespread. I was saying to my wife just a few minutes ago that it's a little like asking in general what's going on, like asking someone in 100 AD, why aren't you standing up to the Roman Empire? You know, it's a big empire here. It's not so easy to stand up to this empire. It's money everywhere, jobs everywhere. You want raises, promotions, influence. You know, this is a machine. This is big business.
Yeah, yeah, that is the reason that the United States is supporting that ethnic cleansing. But what about Europe? Also, Europe is very weak there, especially Germany, France, and Great Britain. They are supporting Israel's policy.
Europe, for me, is the biggest disappointment in the last few years. Look at van der Leyen. Is she paid for by the military-industrial complex? Is she paid for by the U.S. government? Does she just want a job as a NATO Secretary General? I don't know. But she doesn't say anything about Europe's interests. It's only about America's interests. It's all part of the same war machine. I don't get it. You know, what I have been told by leading European politicians, by the way, one said to me, oh, they treat us like children in Washington. I'm not talking about a junior politician, and I don't want to go into names, but I could not believe it when I heard this, because I was talking to someone, a world figure, and you would say, I don't think you should let yourself be treated like children in Washington, but they do. Now, why is that? It is a bit of a puzzle, actually.
But what is the reason that Europe is a willing vassal of United States? Why?
Beats me. I mean, I have to tell you, of course, you could say the nuclear umbrella. You could say the importance of the US and European arms industry. Take any of the big companies in Europe. They're part of the same story. This is also business in Europe. There's no question about it. Still, Europe is paying a heavy price for American militarism. Europe is paying a heavy price for the Ukraine war, because that war, honestly, if anyone knows anything about it, it's because the dimwits in the United States pushed NATO enlargement. And European leaders knew that this was bad news. They knew it from 2008 onward at the Bucharest NATO summit. They said, don't do that, George, talking to George Bush. But do they tell the European people anything about this? No way. And then came the refugee crisis from Syria after 2011. How many European leaders told the truth to the European public that President Obama, wonderful President Obama, signed an order to the CIA to overthrow Bashar al-Assad and led to a refugee crisis in Europe? Well, I assume European leaders know this. It's pretty basic history, but it's not exactly covered in the European press. So Europe, which is a civilization that is 10 times older than the United States, should actually tell the United States, look, you're a kid, you know, you're breaking everything, stop damaging everything that has been built up over hundreds of years. Europe should do that, but it doesn't do that.
How would you assess the quality of European leadership? We don't have any more statesmen like de Gaulle, Kohl, Brandt. What is it? Why?
I can tell you, you can look up the opinion surveys of approval ratings of the European politicians. I think it's Morning Consult that does them, and I look each week. There isn't a popular European leader. The public in Europe is against the leaders. The disapproval ratings are soaring everywhere. So it's not what I say, it's what the European people say. They know that they have weak leaders that are warmongering and that have basically fallen into line with the United States. And there are very few leaders that are saying something different. Viktor Orban is saying something different. I had a long talk with him about the Ukraine war. He makes perfect sense knows the history, has been extremely clear, and oh my God, don't mention him in Brussels or in Washington. But that's because he's telling the truth, actually. Fico in Slovakia, the same way, he's telling the truth. Maybe in the Netherlands, we'll see. It may take them a year to form a government, but the public is not interested in this war. So this is a problem in Europe and the United States. The public is against this war. And in the United States, the public is against the war. But who's asking the public? This is a big business going on. The big business doesn't have to ask the public. That's a little quaint, that idea, that the military-industrial complex has to ask the American people what they think. No way. And by the way, to keep the war going, Blinken, our Secretary of State, simply issues emergency declarations that he's going to ship more arms to Israel because it's a U.S. national security emergency to keep the slaughter going in the Gaza.
What's your opinion? Are we, let me say, peace-loving people and states, especially in Europe, morally obliged to support South African cause to put Israeli on the World Court of Justice?
Of course we should. This is a genocide taking place before our eyes. We are aiming, the public that is, I'm not sure about our governments, but the public is aiming for peace, civility, the international rule of law. Here is a court case, thoroughly documented, 84-page, detailed complaint. To read it is to listen to the horrific words coming out of the mouths of Israeli leaders. Not only the artillery shells coming out of their guns, they're saying what they want to do. And it's absolutely criminal intent. And that's why the South African government has taken this case to the International Court of Justice. And we should be supporting that case. But when the White House was asked about it yesterday, they said, there's no merit in this. They gave one sentence. And then the press was quiet after they gave one sentence. They just denounced the case. They said it's meritless. And that's all. Because there's no serious attempt by the United States government to find any peace right now.
But you proposed 8 peace plan to end that Israeli war in Gaza. And what is very important is that you proposed that there should be no negotiations between Palestinians and Israelis, but the solution should be found within the framework of United Nations and especially of Security Council.
We've had negotiations for 56 years. We don't need any more talking. Everything is clear. Everything is known. Everything that could be said has been said. And the UN Security Council has said all of this for decades, starting with UN Security Council Resolution 242 in 1967. 2 states living in peace side by side on the borders of the 4th of June, 1967, full stop. That's it. We ought to implement that.
Slovenia became a non-permanent member of Security Council now. We will be now sitting there for 2 years. Is it possible for a small country like Slovenia is to pursue an independent policy within the framework of Security Council, because we are members of European Union and of NATO, and I think they can order us, or they would like to press us what we should do in the Security Council?
Well, Slovenia sits as a member state. There is no compulsion to follow a European line. There isn't even a European line. And by the way, it happens that the High Representative of the Commission, Josep Borrell, is at least quoted yesterday as saying the solution needs to be imposed. Good. Okay, there you go. And the way to do it is in the UN Security Council. And the way to do it is to recognize that there is almost surely 13 votes in favor. There is the United States that is the potential veto, and there is the UK that will do anything the United States says it should do. Flip 3 times, sit, lie down, whatever it is, the UK will do it. That's their vote. So the whole issue is the US. And the US needs to understand complicity in genocide is no policy for the United States. It's not in the interest of the American people, and it's not in the interest of Israel.
Then
So
what
if they think they're protecting Israel, all they're doing is creating the biggest existential crisis for Israel, period. Because even the American Jews everywhere outside of Israel are saying, what are you doing? And don't do this in our name.
Yeah, and what would be your advice to Slovenian diplomats sitting in the Security Council? What kind of a policy they should pursue?
What I would strongly suggest is that they discuss this very intensively, because that's the privilege of being on the Security Council, with every other member of the Security Council, that this killing has to stop. It is the responsibility, it's the assignment of the UN Security Council to keep the peace. That's the whole reason it's there. It's not there for 2 years of interesting meetings. It's not there because Slovenia won an election among its peers. It's there to keep the peace. It's the most essential institution for peacemaking and peacekeeping in the world. It's the only one of its kind. So I would suggest that they talk to every other member intensively, with the idea that the UN Security Council needs to act, not in months or years, but in days. There's mass killing going on, and every day that is delayed, the chance of a wider war goes on. And we already had one Israeli minister who was rebuked a little bit, talk about using a nuclear bomb on Gaza. This Security Council needs to act.
Even let me say something, 20 or 25 years ago, late Henry Kissinger said that Israel will cease to exist in 10 years. He was wrong on the date, but I think that geopolitical situation of Israel today is worse than it was before that aggression, because small Israel is surrounded by almost 400 million Muslims and Arabs.
Well, Israel could make peace with its neighbors because since 2002, at the least, the neighbors have said, have a state of Palestine next door, and we make peace with you. We end the hostilities, we end the belligerence, we aim for mutual security of Israel and Palestine. Even after Israel's bombing in Gaza started, the Arab and Islamic leaders met in Riyadh in November and issued a declaration saying, have a Palestinian state normalized, and we will have normal relations with Israel. If Israel is at existential threat, it's because of the policy that Israel is following. What happened in Israel is that the politics went from pragmatism to messianism. Israel fell into the grips of a religious messianic movement. I mean it literally, I don't mean it figuratively. Religious nationalist Jews in Israel took up the idea that God, in the book of Joshua, promised all of the land, including Palestine, so that to have any compromise or retreat would violate God's word. Well, this is messianism. This is not what leads to survival. This is what leads to disaster. And Israel wasn't like that 50 years ago. Oh, it was tough, it was aggressive, but it wasn't like this. This is now extremism. And you look at the cabinet, Netanyahu is an extremist, the finance minister Smotrich is an extremist, the interior minister Ben-Gvir is an extremist, the defense minister Gallant is an extremist. These are people committed to not having a state of Palestine. They're committing to Israeli dominance over all of the territory. But there's 7 million Palestinians there. So that means ethnic cleansing. That's what they're trying to do in Gaza. And it's a war crime, and it is a disaster in every possible way, human, physical, geopolitical.
One of the consequences of the war in Gaza is that war in Ukraine is not anymore in the first pages of the world press. And you proposed a peace plan for Ukraine. What is the essence of this plan?
Look, the peace plan is obvious, which is that NATO would stop any attempt to move to Ukraine. And on that basis, the war would end. Now, every day that has been delayed, the likely terms of the settlement have worsened for Ukraine. The reason is this. When I said NATO enlargement makes no sense back in 2014 or 2013, Russia wasn't making any demand for territory. Then the United States helped to organize a coup in February 2014 to bring down a Ukrainian government that was based on neutrality, to bring in a government that wanted NATO enlargement. That was February 2014. You can listen to Victoria Nuland on tape plotting with the US ambassador who the next government will be. Again, it's not even subtle because the Russians intercepted the call and they put it online for everybody to listen to. Then, during the period from 2014 onward, Russia took back Crimea, where its naval fleet is based, didn't want it to fall into NATO hands. And with regard to the Donbass, it said, negotiate autonomy for the ethnically Russian regions. That's the Minsk I and Minsk II agreements. Minsk II was backed by the UN Security Council. The Ukrainians blew it off. They said, no, we're not going to sign this. The United States told them, don't worry about it, Security Council, what a joke. You don't have to do anything. The French and the Germans, who are the guarantors of Minsk under the Normandy process, blew it off. Even Mrs. Merkel, who I generally respected, said in an interview when she was no longer chancellor, I was just giving the Ukrainians time. Don't sign international agreements by the United Nations Security Council that's just a game. Don't do that. But they did that. And then on December 15th, 2021, Putin put on the table a draft US-Russia security agreement. I called the White House, said, take it, negotiate. You don't have to accept it as a final deal, but the core of it to stop NATO enlargement, by all means. No, Professor Sachs, we'll never close the door to NATO and so forth. And now we have a war. And then as soon as the war started, we had the war starting in 2014. Let me be more careful. Then we had the Russian invasion on February 24th, 2022. But the purpose of the invasion, as was very clear within a few days, was to get Zelensky to go to the negotiating table. And Zelensky said already by the end of February 2022, okay, we'll have neutrality. We'll have neutrality. And they went to Ankara with Turkey mediating. And I know, because I talked to the negotiators, they came to an agreement, close to an agreement. And then the United States stepped in, said, no, you don't agree to that. We're not going to back you on that. You fight on. Isn't that great? Hundreds of thousands more dead since then. That's NATO for you. That's the United States.
Is NATO still a defense organization, or is becoming a very aggressive one?
NATO since 1991 has not been a defense organization. It's been an American expeditionary force. Whether it was the NATO bombing, by the way, in Serbia next door to you in 1999, you bombed Belgrade for 7 weeks as a defense operation? Come on. Come on. How can you bomb Belgrade for 7 weeks and call yourself a defense operation? And then installed the largest NATO base in Europe, in Kosovo. Oh, what an accident. What a coincidence. And then to go on and NATO became the Afghanistan occupation force. That's a defense operation for NATO, the North Atlantic, last time I checked the initials, to be in Afghanistan for 20 years. Oh, and then NATO overthrew the government of Libya. Boy, that's a great defense operation. And then NATO wanted to surround Russia in the Black Sea. That's a very clever idea. Lord Palmerston had it in 1856. Let's do it again. Even, by the way, Zelensky in his New Year's address sounded like he was quoting Lord Palmerston. We know the Black Sea is the crucial area. We're going to take the Black Sea. We're going to kick Russia out of the Black Sea. We're going to take Crimea. Yeah, of course, he's pandering to these, I shouldn't even say it because we should stay polite company, to these people in London and Washington in their dream worlds. Of course, it's not going to happen, but he's still pandering because what does London like to hear? Surround Russia in the Black Sea. That was literally Lord Palmerston's idea 170 years ago. They can't get over it.
Yeah. And what will be the outcome of the war in Ukraine? It seems that Russia will prevail and Ukrainians will be forced to make a sacrifice.
Most likely, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians will die for an outcome that is terrible compared to what it could have been 2 years ago. That's most likely.
You know, one of the reasons for the war in Ukraine is perhaps that the United States was trying to weaken Russia in order to concentrate on China.
I think in general, there was a board game when I was a child called Risk. And the board game was a map of the world. And the goal of the board game was to put your piece on every square of the map. When you were, your piece was up against a neighboring piece, you launched a war against the neighbor. You rolled the dice and you see what happens. And I believe that that is the US game. They want a piece on every square in the map. They want a NATO base in Ukraine. They want a NATO base in Georgia. They want a NATO base in Kosovo. They want a NATO base everywhere. That's the basic idea. The more NATO bases, the more money. The more money, the more contracts, the more jobs, the more riches. It's a machine. It's got its self-fulfilling logic to it. It's completely destructive and illogical, but that's the machine.
You know, the China is surrounding, let me say, about 400 American military bases. Is China really such an enemy as Americans, leading politicians are preaching?
China is an obstacle. It's not an enemy. It's an obstacle to American hegemony. So China's a big problem for the United States. The United States says we need to run the world. And there's this country that doesn't want to be run by the United States. China's not exactly an upstart. China was unified in the year 221 BC. It has a civilization that is 2,200 years old. And the United States is telling it don't do this, don't do that, you're an enemy, and so on. Because China is an affront to the US hegemonic idea. The US idea is no one should rival US power. And China, lo and behold, becomes successful, technologically advanced, richer, economically and militarily powerful. But a threat? No, except if the United States makes it a threat. So the US, as you say, surrounds China with military bases everywhere and then says to China, what are you worried about? It's making an enemy simply because of China's size and success.
But even here in Europe, there is a lot of hesitation how to develop relations with China. The politicians in Brussels, they invented a doctrine of decoupling, and now they are trying, say, to de-risking cooperation with China. Isn't it the same?
Brussels is 100%, I don't mean 99%, 100% following the US line. That's all. Brussels is not thinking about Europe. Brussels is not thinking about the fact that Europe and China share the Eurasian landmass. Brussels is not thinking about the fact that for 2,000 years, trade between China and Europe has been a highly productive activity. The Silk Roads connected the Han Empire and the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago. The relations between China and Europe were highly productive in the last 20 years. Lots of business, lots of tourism, lots of growing relations. The United States stepped in and told Mrs. van der Leyen, no, you need to decouple. Told Europeans, you need to decouple. Called Prime Minister Maloney, literally, you come to Washington, called her to the carpet and said, you have to get out of the Belt and Road Initiative. And then she went home and mumbled, oh, we're out of the Belt and Road Initiative. We're not against China, but we're out of the Belt and Road Initiative. Do you think she came up with that idea on her own? No, I can tell you. She came up with the idea, quote unquote, in the Oval Office because she was told that she had to do that.
The Chinese leadership concluded, I think a week ago, on a meeting that China will become more active internationally this year. Does it mean that China will become a leader of the South countries, of the developing countries, despite of some objections from India?
Well, the most active area is the BRICS countries, which started with 5, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, now adds another 5, Egypt, Ethiopia, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Iran. The 10 will actively pursue new monetary approaches, specifically to stop using the dollar in their transactions, because the US has this very bad habit, which Europe is now siding with. Well, let's confiscate the money of countries that we don't agree with. This is literally the US view, and Europe is, oh, yes, 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 we agree completely. And so the BRICS countries are saying, okay, we can find other ways to trade, thank you. We don't have to go through Euroclear in Belgium. We don't have to go through the SWIFT system. We don't have to use US banks. And by the way, they will succeed in finding non-dollar ways to transact.
What's your opinion? Can a war break out between China and the United States?
A war could break out. It would be catastrophic. The United States could not win such a war. The term win doesn't even make sense. These are 2 nuclear superpowers. If there were a war over Taiwan, Taiwan would be destroyed, and the US would not be able to defeat China, and the world would be on the brink of annihilation. So could a war break out? Yes. We have a lot of stupid politicians in the United States. Believe me, a lot of stupid politicians. And so a war could break out. If Europe has any sense at all, it should tell Americans, stop being so damn belligerent everywhere. This is not a game. This is not a money-making operation. This is our survival. Stop it. This is what Europe should be telling the United States. Europe learned a lot about war in World War I and World War II. Such a disaster, cataclysmic. So Europe decided after World War II, we're going to do something a different way. Europe learned a lot about cooperation, actually. The United States is poisoning a lot of what Europe learned. Europe should stick by what it learned. By the way, one of the real achievements of Europe, now forgotten, was the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. That brought dozens of countries together in a common security arrangement. Of course, the United States can't stand it. It's not NATO. But what for Europe it is something really important. The idea of collective security, the idea that you don't draw the boundary that Russia's the enemy, Ukraine is ours, we do everything we can to weaken the other side. This is primitive stuff. And after all that Europe went through, Europe should be the first to say that's primitive stuff. But that's American thinking, primitive stuff. And Europe should have a better idea. And it already was on the way to a better idea. But to tell you the truth, it's shocking to me. You know, countries that I really admired their society and their governance, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, they're all warmongering right now. They're all in the forefront of NATO. They're all gung-ho, we must oppose Russia. I happen to know the leaders of these countries believed something very different 10 years ago. So what happened to them?
Yeah, you know, a lot will be decided next year or this year with the American elections. What's your prediction? What will be outcome? Will the President Biden prevail, even if he's very weak, or former President Trump will win the elections?
I think the US will have a lot of instability and a lot of unpredictability this year. Biden is 81 and is in no physical or mental shape to run again for re-election. This is obvious. Trump is unstable. He has dozens of criminal and civil lawsuits against him. This is our current situation. Both have enormous disapproval ratings, much higher than approval ratings. And the public is extremely on edge and is against the wars also. So there's a lot of instability ahead this year.
And what will happen if Trump will prevail?
What will happen if either prevails? We're on a very dangerous track right now. We have no clarity of our direction, our policy, our common sense. And so this is really a very unhappy situation. And I'm hoping that before the end of this, we have different candidates that stand for some decency and that can win the presidency. And I would not exclude that. It seems very unlikely, but it's not impossible.
And what are the reasons that American democracy deteriorates very much?
Basically, corruption. American politics became very corrupt starting in the 1970s. The limits on campaign financing, one by one, were stripped away by the Supreme Court, interestingly, in response to a campaign by the big corporate leaders, and literally a campaign by the Chamber of Commerce and other corporate leaders. So today we have no limits on campaign spending, and this election cycle will be probably about $15 billion or more. And by the way, it's not very much money. This is a rich country, but these politicians go cheap. They look for 100,000, 200,000, 500,000 for their reelection campaign, and then they vote along with their corporate sponsors, whether it's the military or whether it's Wall Street or whether it's the gun manufacturers or whether it's the big health industry, which gives us the most expensive health system in the world. Not the best, the most expensive. We rank something like 40th in life expectancy, but by far number one in cost per person. And this is the American lobby system. So Congress got bought out by special interests. The White House got bought out by special interests. Foreign policy got bought out by special interests. I think it's probably true that every kind of political system can be hacked. And to hack a democracy, a very efficient way to do it is through money. One way is to close down elections, but the other way is to keep the elections, but make them basically referendums on who gets the most money. And that's what happened in the United States.
And now for the end, if I understand you right, you predict that situation in the world in future will be very unstable. The German sociologist Spengler, he predicted 100 years ago that that's the end of the European influence in the world. How do you see the future of Europe and of the world in this year?
Well, I think there's a very basic point, which is that Europe's very high influence in the world is a modern phenomenon. It really started in 1500. Before that, Europe was the poor appendage of Eurasia. The real action in Eurasia was China, India, the Middle East, Baghdad, the Mongols, you name it, but not Europe. Europe was a backwater. That's not true, by the way. Going back 2,000 years, the Roman Empire was really something. And intellectually, the Greeks were really something. The Greeks were really something, and their influence has lasted for 2,500 years in a formative way. I mean, any scholar is a student of Aristotle, and there's no question about it. But the European geopolitical influence ended with the Roman Empire, 476, and the events that came meant that between 500 and 1500, the main story was somewhere from the Middle East eastward to the rest. Then, starting in the 1500s with the oceanic empires of Spain and Portugal and Holland and Britain, and then France and so on, Europe's rise in relative power came. And then with industrialization, Europe completely dominated. So from the 19th and 20th centuries, it was a European world. But now we're going back to a rebalancing, and the rebalancing is quite fundamental. The rise of Asia is even beyond China. It's India, it's China, it's Southeast Asia. The rise of Africa is absolutely going to be real and significant, and Africa is going to be a quarter of the world population soon, by mid-century. And so Europe's lead was a temporary aberration of the last 200 to 300 years. That's okay. Europe doesn't have to disappear. It doesn't have to lose its prosperity, but its uniqueness as world leader was temporary. And by the way, Europe did a considerable amount to accelerate its own decline, of course, because it fought two civil wars in the 20th century that were completely disastrous, and it behaved very badly as empires, very nasty. So you combine those two things, and Europe did a lot to accelerate. Now, I happen to like Europe. I like European civilization. I like the European Union when it's not simply following along behind the United States on a leash, and believe that Europe has a great deal to contribute to our world and is the home of a remarkable civilization built over more than 2,000 years. So I'm not pessimistic in that sense, like Spengler in that sense. I would like to see global peace. I happen to tremendously admire Chinese civilization and others as well, and Arab civilization, and believe we should really enjoy each other's company and make peace and not count who's number one and who's number two and who's number 5 and who's number 10 in the way that we do. The United States doesn't have this mentality. It doesn't have it in its head, a cooperative multilateral world. The American idea is a multilateral world that the US leads. Even Biden, who's an old man and speaks like he's 30 years out of date, explains the American mentality. He says, we're the indispensable country, we're the leader, everyone looks to us. Oh yeah, everyone looks to us and everyone votes against us. You know, it's a little weird. But in any event, the US doesn't understand this rebalancing is a good thing. It just means that others are catching up and that we could have normal relations. Now, Europe, remember, the European Union is 450 million people. It's a little over 5% of the world population. It should take care. It should help build a multipolar world. The West, so-called, add the United States and Europe, you have 800 million people. That's 1/10 of the world population. We're leading the world? Come on, let's grow up. Let's be part of the world. Let's have good relations with India, with China, with the Arab world, with the Muslim world, with South America. That would be normal. So I think that this is the story. I'm not at all pessimistic in terms of our know-how, our ingenuity, our ability to face crises like climate change and others, but it's the human side. We should not be aiming to run the world. We should be aiming to build a cooperative world.
Professor, thank you very much for your very good and decisive information you gave to us.
Good. Thank you. Great to be with you and Happy New Year.